Right, it's here. Record. It is recorded. It should be recorded. It stands. Record. Yeah, then close recording stop.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, no worries. That's the next one.
Okay.
All right, hello, everyone. It's nice to see a few faces I know, and nice to see a lot of faces I don't yet know, but hopefully will know very shortly. As Enrique said, my main interest is in French as a second language, and so for those of you sitting in the room thinking, what do I have to learn from somebody who's going to talk to me about French as a second language, never fear. What I have to say is really, I hope, going to be interesting across languages. So I heard a little bit of French at the end of the table over there, so that's always a good sign. But even if you're here with an interest in a language other than French, don't imagine that this means that somehow what I have to say won't be interesting to you. But you can tell me at the end. So here's a rough idea. I mean, the best laid plans, as they say. This is what I imagined we might do. I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to me and to the talk. Then I'll share with you the results of two studies. One is a study on teacher practice, and I'm going to split it into two parts. One, I'm going to start looking at what teachers were doing in their classrooms before they engaged in professional learning around the CEFR. Then I'm going to interject with some findings from a study on student proficiency and confidence, to try to see if there's any kind of match between what we know the teachers are doing and what we know the students are doing. And then we'll circle around back to the teacher practice to see what are the teachers doing now after their professional learning, to see is that meeting the areas of greatest need for the students. So that's the plan. And then a conclusion and discussion. But as Enrica can let me know if this works for her, but as far as I'm concerned, if you have questions as we're going, especially if they're questions that you really want answered, I'm perfectly happy to take questions as we go. I'm getting a nod from Enrica, I think.
Yeah.
Perfect. Excellent. All right, so a little bit about me. I'm notoriously terrible at introducing myself. I never know what people want to know about me, and I always leave out the most interesting things, and then someone will go after me and introduce themselves, and I'll think, oh shoot, I should have said that. So I'll tell you a little bit about my research, but I think the most interesting thing about me connected to tonight's talk is that I have 3 kids of my own who are in French immersion. And one is in grade 7, so he's in middle school. One is in grade 5, so she's at the end of elementary school, and one's just in grade 1 in my board, just starting French immersion. So nicely spaced out, and makes my research all that more relevant to me. Not necessarily to you, but to me. And we all know the world revolves around me, right? Absolutely kidding. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of insight into the kind of research that I do, it involves French in Canada. And I look at French in Canada from several different angles, but what I'll talk about tonight with you is the connection between teacher practice and student language outcomes. And in this area, I have 3 sort of main projects on the go. One is looking at first language speakers of French, so what we call francophones. And they are in majority context and minority context. So in Canada, a francophone majority context means that people are living in communities where francophones represent the largest group of speakers in that community. So that's a majority context. A minority context would be somewhere, for example, like Toronto, where, and this, I always have to say this, I don't actually say Toronto unless I'm lecturing. I remember once one of my students came to me and said, you can't possibly be from Toronto because you say Toronto. I said, well, I can say Toronto like the rest of us. So anyway, so in Toronto, French is a minority language because the majority of speakers are not francophones. So in this context and in L2 contexts, meaning at the secondary level, and at the post-secondary level, I look at teachers' sociolinguistic modeling in the classroom. So what kind of variant choices do teachers make in the classroom? So do they say, I'll give you an example in English, do they say good morning? Do they say hello? Do they say hi? Do they say yo? Right? So which kind of words or forms do teachers choose to use in the classroom? And what kind of model does this present to students of the language? And I look at the students' sociolinguistic outcomes by looking at their variant use. And to see, particularly in minority contexts where exposure to French, despite them being francophones, is still primarily through the school, okay? Or in the L2 context where it's almost exclusively through the school. The second project that I'd like to talk to you about, and this is in fact going to be what I talk to you about tonight, looks again at the L2 context across immersion, extended, and core French programs. Do you know those terms? Are they familiar to you? Yeah, core French being kind of the 1 hour every other day or every 3 days, whatever. Immersion being the opposite end, where you learn subject matter through French, in this case, and then extended being kind of somewhere in the middle. Yeah. Okay, so looking at these three contexts, looking at teachers' pedagogical practice in terms of their planning, their teaching, and their evaluation, and looking at students' outcomes in terms of proficiency and in terms of confidence. So the central questions that I'd like to address with you tonight are these. For the teachers, how would they describe their practices in terms of planning, teaching, and assessment before they engaged in professional learning around the CEFR? So I'm calling that CEFRPD, PD meaning professional development. The other question is, for the students, what kinds of proficiency and confidence strengths and weaknesses do they either display for proficiency or claim for confidence? And how do they connect to what the teachers are doing? And then finally, the teachers, after their CEFR-informed professional development, what kind of teaching practices do they report in terms of planning, in-class teaching, and assessment? Sound good with me so far? Mm-hmm. Excellent. How about online? Good? Good. Yeah. I didn't even know what it was.
It's a reminder.
Oh. All right, so I'm guessing with Enrica as your professor, this is all something that you've heard, but just in case, what is it that we know, hopefully, about the CEFR? Do your students know about the CEFR? I think they had at least one talk.
I gave a talk at the beginning. Some of them were in the methodology course, so they know quite a lot.
Perfect.
And others don't because they are just in this course. But
okay, so this will be review for some of you and brand new for others of you. So it's either too much or too little information, but we'll go with it. So the CEFR is the Common European Framework of Reference, and it's a framework that describes language proficiency at 6 different levels. There's the A level, A1 and A2, which is what we call the basic user stage. The B1 and B2 level, the independent user stage, and the C1 and C2 level, which is the proficient user stage. So this framework helps to describe what learners can do at each of these proficiency levels. And what's nice about can do is it's not what they can't do, right? It's what they can do, which is a very minor looking change, but a major reconceptualization of thinking about proficiency. Is what I actually can do, not what I can't. So at level A1, users can use everyday expressions and basic phrases to satisfy their immediate needs. A2 level, they can engage in routine tasks and exchange information about routine matters. At level B1, learners can use simple connected text on familiar topics. Level B2, there's quite a jump really between B1 and B2. They can show a degree of fluency and spontaneity in their language, which makes interaction with native speakers quite possible. And level C1, they can use language effectively for social, academic, and professional purposes. And at C2, they can express themselves spontaneously and precisely, even in complex situations. Now, I'm sure Enrique's cringing because this is trying to take a monster document and reduce it to, 3 words per, but it gives you the general idea in case it's something you're not familiar with. So there are 4 modes of activity included in the CEFR. However, I'm sure Enrique has been telling you that thanks largely in part to Enrique's efforts, the CEFR is growing and expanding. But let me tell you these 4. Reception, which is listening and reading. Production, which is speaking and writing. Interaction, and this is sort of my wording, sort of a social use of language. And mediation, which is a co-construction of meaning. So hopefully that, if you weren't familiar with the CEFR, it gives you just kind of a general idea of what we're talking about. So what kind of inroads has the CEFR made in Canadian French as a second language, or FSL? Well, it's relatively recent. The framework itself is not. It's from 2001. But in Canada, in FSL, it's fairly recent, within the last 10 years. Its impact is partial. It's been taken up in only some of the Canadian provinces and to varying degrees within and across provinces. Ontario, thankfully, being among the leaders at the forefront in Canadian FSL for CEFR. The action-oriented approach is really what grabs many teachers because of its potential to make students feel as though they're using more French and gaining communicative abilities rather than sort of discrete, distanced linguistic knowledge. Hopefully it will result in improved proficiency and confidence for the students, higher retention rates in French. If you're familiar at all with the Canadian FSL scene, after grade 9, when it stops being compulsory, we say in French, the chute, the drop rate is astronomical. So it's hopefully eventually going to help with that. And higher rates of functionally bilingual graduates. That's the hope. Okay. So with that context in mind, are we good to continue? Do you have a sense of where I'm leading you? And online? We're good? Excellent. All right, so the 2 projects that I want to tell you a bit about are about Ontario context. The first one has to do with the students' proficiency and confidence, and it looked at 434 grade 12 Ontario FSL students from core, the sort of regular, extended, halfway, and immersion, fully immersed. So looking at 434 students from across these programs and looking at their DELF proficiency results. Now, the DELF is the CEFR-based proficiency exam. And the students in this project were allowed to choose which level of the DELF they wanted to take. And 84 of these students chose A2, 207 chose B1, and 143 chose B2. Nobody chose A1, and nobody chose C or C1 or up. In terms of confidence, the students responded to a survey asking them about their FSL confidence. This was a survey I had designed, asking them about how confident they felt in different kinds of situations with different kinds of, I'll use the word interlocutor, but sometimes it was a written exchange. So how confident are you to speak or to read or to write in these different kinds of situations? What factors impact that level of confidence for you? The second project looks at teachers' pedagogical practices. And this is with 103 teachers from across the province of Ontario. These teachers are FSL teachers from kindergarten to grade 12. The reason they're not only in grade 12 is because the students who are in grade 12 have experienced teachers across the grades, those who have been at least in the Ontario system, So 103 teachers from K to 12, from core, extended, and immersion. And they responded to an online survey asking them to report on their practices in the classroom in terms of planning, teaching, and evaluating before their CEFR-informed professional development and after. So these participants were invited to participate in the study, and we'll get back to this kind of in the end, but you can already keep that in mind. If you're invited to participate, these teachers were invited by their FSL project leads in their board. Who are the project leads going to invite? The most positively oriented people, right? So keep that in mind. It doesn't negate anything that we're about to say, but just remember, this is sort of the cream of the crop, if you will, of people who are positively oriented and open to the CEFR and who have engaged in some way with the CEFR. Okay?
And then was Enrica's study done at about the same time, the quality CEFR? Because
Before
yeah,
it was, but
it
it was totally independent.
totally independent.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, our offices are side by side, but we're
Yeah.
totally independent. How crazy is that?
Yeah.
However, hers was an extension of yours.
Well, let's say that they are complementary.
Complementary,
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, Enrica and I need to spend more time with each other.
We hope so. We have plans, but
Precisely. Life keeps getting in the way.
Yeah.
Enrica and I get along very well, in case you can't tell. Okay, so I'd like to start by telling you about the teachers' reported practices before their CEFR informed professional development. So before their CEFR informed PD, I'll just call it CEFRPD, they were asked what kinds of strategies, and that term is used very broadly, they were using in their planning for their teaching. So we asked them, when you plan your FSL teaching, do you focus on linguistic competence, pragmatic competence, sociolinguistic competence? And as you can see, what did they prefer? Linguistic competence, right? So there was an imbalance across these different competencies with an over-focusing, if you will, on linguistic competence. They were also asked what kinds of tasks and situations they planned for their teaching. Individualized tasks, authentic tasks, or authentic situations, and action-oriented tasks. As you can see, action-oriented tasks were not really on their radar in the way that individualized tasks or authentic situations were. And finally, we asked them, what kind of use do you make of self-assessments, your students' own self-assessments? And this was the least on their radar of all of these items. Before their CEFRPD, as you can see, the teachers planned their teaching to prioritize the written skills over the oral skills, with writing accounting for much of their focus, and listening accounting for very little, and speaking and reading somewhere in the middle. Now remember, if you're not an FSL teacher, you don't have to just be thinking about this in terms of FSL. If you're an English teacher, I've given similar kinds of talks to teachers from China who are interested in EFL, and they say, it's exactly the same. It's like you came to China and studied what we do. So, I mean, it may not be exactly the same for you, but just try to keep thinking in your mind, how does this connect with what you know? Before their CEFRPD, how were these teachers presenting language in their classrooms? Well, these teachers, half of them, well, more than half, just around 48% of them were presenting language in isolated and disconnected ways. So for example, and I was joking with Winnie earlier, one of my teachers used to give us sentences in the singular and we'd have to put them in the plural. And so we used to write it is a cat. And we would go they, r, blanks, s, and then we put in cat, dog, dish, spoon, whatever, and talk about completely disconnected to any kind of reality or use of language in any meaningful way, right? Especially since many francophones don't even say ce sont des chats, they say c'est des chats. For those of you who don't speak French, they don't say these are cats, they say it's cats. So talk about completely disconnected. Where most of the rest of the teachers fell was in presenting language through themes, focusing mostly on vocabulary. Very few teachers, as you can see from this graph here, were presenting language with any kind of real emphasis on speech acts or on demand based on what the students actually needed to know in order to communicate what they wanted to say. I tend to use say in a generic way, writing, listening, reading.
Can I just say
please.
one little thing? It was in the slide before. In the course on assessment, we studied last time how neglected listening is as a skill, no? And
you can see it here.
It's really like incredible, especially if you think that we are in languages and the most common thing is understanding, like listening to other people and understanding.
Well, and when you think about first language acquisition, what's the first thing you learn to do? You learn to listen. How can you interact in the world if you don't know how to listen? No, it's good. Yeah. So as you can see, language is being presented essentially in isolation or through thematized vocabulary. In terms of assessment practices before professional development around the CEFR, what were the teachers doing? Well, primarily they were focusing on forms, right? They were focusing on forms either for the goals and the criteria and the feedback, or if their goals were more lofty, they sort of returned to safe ground by focusing on the forms for the criteria of their evaluation or assessment and in their feedback. And so if you add you're faster than I am, 40, 50, 60, that's 70%. 70% of the students said the teachers said they're focusing on form either for all three or for two of the three. Very few teachers were focusing on the quality of the students' use of the language, or even more ideally, on the students' ability to produce and understand actual communication in French. In terms of what they were assessing, we asked them how often does their assessment focus on grammatical accuracy, orthographic control, and phonological control. And as you can see, these were all quite high. In fact, when you look across, those three were higher than anything else. We asked them, how often do you focus on vocabulary control and vocabulary range? Vocabulary range is the sort of repertoire of words that you have at your disposal, like repertoire. And control is, well, do you use it in a way that makes sense and is sort of fitting the sentence and fitting the context? Yeah. We ask them about coherence and cohesion and fluency. What degree of attention do they pay to this? And as you can see, as we go down, as we get more aligned with the CEFR, the frequency tends to drop. And then in terms of focus on linguistic versus pragmatic versus sociolinguistic competence in their assessment of their students' work, linguistic, of course, was the highest. Pragmatic was the second, and sociolinguistic, of course, as the poor cousin, was third. So what does this tell us? Well, there's a heavy focus on structural precision. Vocabulary is focused on less than structure. There's even less of a focus on fluency than there is on accuracy. And there's an imbalance in the stressing of linguistic competence. So what kind of conclusions can we reach about this from the teachers' self-reports? Before their CEFR-informed professional development, their planning stressed linguistic competence through individualized tasks with a focus on the written skills. I mean, this isn't the end of the world. There's lots of great stuff still in here, but it's very particular in what the focus is. In terms of teaching in the classroom, so that was the planning. In terms of the teaching, the teachers presented language primarily in isolation and emphasized thematic vocabulary. And in their assessment, they carried this through, prioritizing form over function, particularly for the criteria and the feedback, and paying attention to structural precision above all else. So with this in mind, we can ask ourselves, well, what impact would these kinds of practices have on the students' outcomes? What would you guess? With this kind of focus, would you guess that they would be really good at writing and writing accurately, but speaking and listening less well? That's what I would guess. If I didn't know anything, if I came into it blind, I would think with this kind of
They're
focus.
very good with their grammar rules and all their exact grammar.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I would guess.
Yeah.
Winnie?
You mentioned form over function. Can
Yeah.
you give us an example of that?
Yeah. So, for example, I know that, I'm just going to use English as an example because I know you all understand English. I know that to form the plural in English, I add an S. And I know that the plural of sheep is not sheeps, it's sheep. So I know that form. But when I get out into the world and I try to use my language to communicate, and I want to actually make this form function for me, to do something with it, I am visiting a farm and I want to ask about the sheep. And I want to say, where do you keep your sheeps? Even though I know that the plural of sheep is sheeps, I say, the plural of sheep is not sheep. Even though I know the plural of sheep is sheeps, sheep. It's sheep. This is a terrible example. I say sheeps because in the heat of the moment, you get all upset and you say something that comes automatically. The automaticity hasn't been ingrained. I haven't been practicing in real context. I can take a rule and apply it, but the subtleties of it and how it really suits my needs to do something in the world haven't been practiced. So I'm pretty good with the form, but I'm not really good at making that form function for me. Does that make sense? Yeah, despite all my mistakes in that example. Yeah, I think you had a hand up and then.
I was going to say also a lack of confidence with communicating in more spontaneous context.
Absolutely, as we'll see in the following slides when we look at the confidence. Yeah. Yeah.
And the thing with when you ask students, hi, how are you? They automatically say, I'm doing well, thank you, and you. But if you go into the context, then maybe it's a stranger, you may not care how they're doing, but you automatically, maybe somebody who's a little strange to you, you're automatically going to ask them who they are and continue the conversation when that doesn't work best for you in that situation. So I think, yeah, with the students too, that you may not care how I am, and you don't have to ask me how I am, just that they automatically.
Yeah, so I mean, it's really funny how in moments of stress, and you don't even have to feel stressed, but just in moments of tension, where does your mind go? Well, your mind goes to what you learned first and what you learned best. So if what you learned first is filling in blanks and what you learned best is filling in blanks, you're probably pretty good at filling in blanks even when you're stressed, right? But if you haven't done much early real communicating, that's going to be really hard for you in times of stress. Even if stress simply means speaking to your professor or speaking to a native speaker or speaking to a stranger, that's what's going to feel difficult. But which is a perfect segue into the student results. What do the students do? So we'll look at their proficiency through the DELF exam results. Remember, the DELF is the CEFR aligned proficiency exam. And we'll look at their proficiency confidence outcomes from the self-reports in the survey. All right, so looking first at student proficiency, this is the global we. I have really, really wonderful research assistants who have worked with me on these projects, and none of them is here in this room. Unfortunately, they didn't come. Last time I presented here at OISE, some of my RAs were in the room, so they came up and sort of helped with the presentation a little. But if you're an FSL-oriented person, keep in touch with me in case I have research opportunities for you. But so what we discovered was, in terms of their overall outcomes on this DELF exam, their written comprehension scored the best. Written comprehension is DELF's fancy way of saying reading. Yeah. So written comprehension, reading, was the skill on which they scored the highest. Very surprisingly, what came next? Oral production and written production, essentially, they're statistically tied, though you can't really tell from here. That's because you're combining results from core, extended, and immersion. So for those of you who don't know the Canadian context, you may be thinking, so what? For those of you who know the Canadian context, immersion students talk a lot, but not necessarily, this is a huge generalization, by the way. They like to talk a lot generally, but maybe not with high accuracy. Core French students tend to write more than they speak, but again, still not with a high level necessarily of accuracy. But the two programs tend to do quite different things. And if you think about the structure of the programs, it makes sense, right? The immersion students, they're trying to talk about history, or they're trying to talk about social studies or math or whatever. And so they need their French to talk. In many core French classes, and I'm pretty sure, I know a couple of the French folks here, your classes are excluded from what I'm about to say, but speaking from my own previous experience, lots of core French teachers have worksheets that the students fill in. Not everyone. So written production and oral production end up being about the same, with the immersion students higher on the oral and the core French students higher on the written. And last, the oral comprehension, the listening. So what do we see here? The written skills either match or outpace the oral skills. And within the written skills, we see that the receptive is outpacing the productive. Receptive and productive.
Sorry, for the oral, and maybe you, for oral comprehension,
yes,
like that's like, listen to this newscast and tell me about it. Like, are they expected to respond in French, or can they respond in another language?
So the listening one in the DELF, you write down the answer for this part of it. What's really interesting in the DELF, and Enrica, I'm sure, has strong feelings, maybe, I'm trying to anticipate, about the listening component of the DELF. I can tell you the listening component of the DELF is very difficult because you're not just testing your listening, you're testing your attention, you're testing recall. So one of the examples, you're in a train station and they're giving you arrival times in the 24-hour clock, you know, like 1830, you can tell I'm not European. And then you're supposed to answer when the train is coming, but the answer is in the 12-hour clock. So what's 1830? That's 6:30, right? So even there, I'm like, okay, 6:30. So 18 minus 12 is, and so already stuff is going past. So the listening comprehension part is really hard for several reasons. First, it's hard because it's in French and it's fast and whatever, but then it's also hard because you have to pay attention to details that are going by very quickly and you have to retain them and recall them. So it's a complex part of the test.
In these hours, these replies are in French or in English? They're all in French. Huh?
They're all in French.
Yeah. Then you have this extra
layer
that you have to write in French. So,
yeah. And so you're not testing only listening comprehension, you're also testing the ability to read it and then
Yeah,
write it
exactly. You test the 3 competencies.
Yeah.
in one.
And that was my question.
Very good question
Yeah.
and very good answer.
Because it's like, yeah, because you're now being tested doubly
Yeah.
on not only your comprehension, but your ability to communicate what you understood, right?
Precisely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
That's
Yeah.
exactly one of the things that we discussed the last time, and one of the flaws of assessment of tests, that they don't realize that they test others' invisible things.
Absolutely, which can have very little to do with listening in a real world. So for example, I've been on the subway in Toronto multiple times where the announcement comes on and says, and you're like, what? What I do, I turn to the person beside me and I say, what did they say? Right, and they've caught part of it, I've caught part of it, we put it together, and we managed to figure it out. Well, on the DELF exam, I don't think I could turn to, what did they say? I don't think they let me do that, right? So I mean, there is a difference between listening in reality and listening on a test. It's not really the fault of the DELF. I mean, testing is different from real life. Yeah. All right, in terms of the sub-skills outcomes, so looking at, there's a writing component where there are all these little descriptors of sub-abilities for the writing and for the speaking. And in terms of what the students scored highest on and what they scored lowest on, the range is here. They're all out of 100. But remember, we had students who challenged A2, B1, or B2. This is looking across those 3 groups. That's why you get this range. In terms of the written sub-skills, the students scored highest on their ability to follow instructions, to be able to provide descriptions, and to be sort of coherent in their writing. They were weaker on their ability to spell correctly and to control, use a range of vocabulary, and even lower on the ability to control that range of vocabulary and to write in a morphosyntactically correct way. Morphosyntax is just a fancy word for saying, are the sentences sort of structured properly and are the words formed properly? In terms of speaking, the students did best at responding, so not initiating, but responding, introducing themselves. They scored well also on phonology, which is the sound, so they were able to speak in a way that sounded nice. They did less well in terms of being able to present the topic, and even less well in terms of the morphosyntax, so how did they structure their sentences and the words within them. Did less well controlling their vocabulary, and surprisingly, if you expect it to be the same as writing, which we shouldn't, less well on coherence. So think about the difference between planning something out when you write, moving sentences around, erasing things, changing it, and speaking, where once you've said sheep too many times, you can't undo it, right? I mean, whatever comes out, comes out. So the coherence in speaking is noticeably lower than the coherence in the writing. So what do these scores tell us? Well, the writing scores are clearly outpacing the oral interaction scores. The presentation measures are outpacing the accuracy measures for writing. But this pattern of presenting being better than accuracy is not quite as coherent and cohesive for the oral interaction, because we see coherence at the bottom for the oral interaction, and we see presenting the topic somewhere in the middle, and we see introducing and responding up at the top. In terms of confidence now, the students reported feeling most confident with their reading, less confident with the other skills, but more confident listening than writing, and certainly least confident in conversing. So what this shows us is probably not a surprise given what we've seen before, but they are more confident in their written skills than in their oral skills, and more confident in their receptive skills than in their productive skills. So when you put productive and oral together to get speaking, that's why you end up with this really low confidence level conversing. So what have we seen then in terms of the students' proficiency and confidence? Well, in terms of proficiency, we've seen that the students are developing stronger written skills than oral skills. They're having more difficulty producing messages than receiving them. Their writing is more coherent than it is accurate, and their speaking shows difficulty with both of these elements. In terms of confidence, the students' confidence matches their proficiency, more or less, except they're overconfident in their listening. And their conversing confidence is by far the lowest. So how do students' results reflect teacher results? So the teacher practices, are they lining up with what we're seeing for the students? How are my online folks? I haven't checked in with you for a while. You doing okay? Yeah? Okay.
Can I
Yeah,
ask you one thing?
Please.
The overconfident in listening, you drew that conclusion on by comparing with the results?
With the DELF results. Okay. Yeah, so overconfident is sort of a shorthand way of saying their level of confidence for listening is not that much lower than their level of confidence for reading, as you can see here. But if you flip back to their DELF results, you can see that their reading is, I mean, this graph, every little minute difference on this graph is statistically significant. So they're really more proficient in their reading than they are in their listening. Thank you. Yeah. But all of this, of course, taken with a little grain of salt, because we know that the test for listening is quite hard. Yeah.
Yes. Did they receive their DELF results before they answered your survey?
No.
That was before, and then
so they wrote the DELF test first, and then that same day they went down the hall.
Okay.
And wrote. Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good question, because if you get it back and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so terrible at
but they'd also
whatever.
had the experience of doing a listening test before they did it.
Yeah, but they were still pretty confident.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm in the right place here. Teacher practice now.
No.
I've gone too far. There we go. There we go.
Yeah.
All right. So how do the student results compare to the teacher practice? Well, the teacher's focus on written skills, if you recall, over the oral skills is really reflective of the students' higher written outcomes than oral outcomes. We can't make a causal connection because the studies were separate studies. They're not the same individuals. So this isn't a causal connection. I'm looking for correlations. I'm looking for similar patterns. So I can't say the teacher did this, therefore the students did this. So don't take it that way, but look at it as we have grade 12 students from Ontario who have gone through these programs. We're also looking at what teachers have done. Is there any connection between what the teachers are doing and what the student outcomes are? Okay. So the teacher's focus on the written skills is reflected in the students' higher proficiency in the written skills than in the oral skills. The teacher's isolated or disconnected presentation of language is reflective of the student's difficulty to use forms accurately or fluently in context. The teacher's presentation of vocabulary through themes rather than in authentic contexts is reflected in the student's difficulty to use forms in authentic contexts. And interestingly, despite the teacher's assessment focusing on precision of structures and forms, the student's control over these forms in, quote, real use is still relatively weak. So you might think that it would lead to really high levels of precision, but it doesn't seem to be. So the student outcomes appear to be closely matching the teacher's practices, except that the focus on forms does not seem to be leading to greater accuracy. So shall we have a quick look then at what are the teachers reporting in terms of their practice after having gone through quite a lot of professional development related to the CEFR. Yes,
Which
question.
is the professional development look like?
Yeah, so the professional development look different for every teacher because not every teacher engages in the same thing. These are teachers from 64 different boards across the province. And it included all kinds of things. The one thing that all of the teachers had in common is that they were DELF trained correctors, so the correctors of the DELF exam. So they had to have had that kind of training. The PD also included school board workshops, ministry run workshops, mentoring relationships with people in their schools who were CEFR experts, self-studies, all different kinds of activities. In one of the articles that you had to read for today, there's a really nice long list in a chart that gives you all of the examples, but those are some of the ones that I can pull off the top of my head this late at night. With 3 little kids, I've been up since 6 o'clock this morning. I know that's only 12 hours, but my poor little mind after 12 hours says, okay, that's enough. Okay, are we good? Yeah. All right, so looking now at their after practices. So this is the same chart that we saw from before, but these are now with the results from after. So asking the teachers, in your planning, do you focus mostly on linguistic competence, pragmatic competence, or sociolinguistic competence? Well, what we see here is a fairly evenly balanced focus across the 3 competencies, and we no longer see the unbalanced stress on linguistic competence that we saw in the self-reports of their practices before their PD. Asking them what kinds of tasks and situations they plan for their classes, we see that the teachers are focusing really on all 3 kinds of tasks, but least on individualized tasks, which you'll remember was their preference beforehand. Action-oriented tasks are no longer the poor cousin. They're no longer less important. And do you remember in our previous slide, the self-assessments, asking students to assess their own abilities was the lowest bar on the graph by far? It's still among the lowest, but lowest within a much, much smaller scale. So 4.0, 4.0, 4.1, 4.3, 4.5. So there really has been this sort of leveling off, no longer prioritizing linguistic over everything else, accuracy over everything else. In terms of how they plan their focus across the different skills, what we see here is speaking is 37%, listening 34%, writing 20%, and reading 19%. So what we're seeing is a preference now for planning for activities to perfect the oral skills rather than the written. So there's no longer an overemphasis on the written skills. Planning now emphasizes speaking above all. In terms of how the teachers are presenting language in the class, do you recall what the graph looked like before, with isolated and disconnected ways and thematic vocabulary accounting for nearly everything? It now accounts for nearly nothing. So the teachers are no longer presenting language, reporting that they're no longer presenting language in isolation or thematically through vocabulary, but focusing relatively equally either on speech acts. Do you know what a speech act is? Yeah, so how do you greet somebody? How do you apologize? How do you take your leave? How do you say goodbye, in other words? So what kind of speech acts can we perform? Which is nice because at least it's communicative, it's interactive, it's contextually bound. And even nicer, on demand, based on what the students want to communicate. So you want to tell me what you did on the weekend? Well, you're not going to speak in future, you're going to speak in past tense, and we need to know the past tense, but because we actually need to know the past tense, rather than I'm just going to teach you the past tense, right? In terms of assessment, Do you remember we looked at this before their PD, and the teachers were focusing on the form of what students were producing in terms of the goals, the criteria, and the feedback? Well, you now see that the teachers are focusing almost exclusively on the student's ability to produce and understand communication in French. So it's this dramatic reversal. In terms of what they're assessing, in terms of grammatical accuracy, orthographic control, and phonological control, it's not like these accuracy measures have fallen off the map. Do you remember with the communicative approach, it was like the swinging pendulum that said, okay, all grammar, no grammar, which was not, by the way, how communicative teaching was supposed to be. It's just how it happened to have been taken up. But it's the swinging of the pendulum seems to, at least in these teachers' self-reports, have stopped quite nicely somewhere in the middle. So there's no longer an overemphasis on structural precision, but neither is there an underemphasis on structural precision. Vocabulary we see is no longer subservient to structure. So structure and vocabulary seem to be quite nicely paired. Fluency is no longer subservient to accuracy. And we see that linguistic competence is no longer being emphasized over the other competencies. There's quite a nice balance across the three. So if I were to look at this, I would say that there is less focus on the accuracy than there is on the fluency, but not by the same lopsided margins that we were seeing before the PD in the opposite directions. Does that make sense? What can we conclude about the teachers' practices after their CEFR-informed professional development? Well, we see that their planning is balancing itself in its emphasis across the competencies. They're using self-assessments and action-oriented tasks, and they're focusing on the oral skills, particularly on speaking. Remembering that this is self-reports, and we'll come back to this again. In terms of their teaching, they're reporting presenting language on demand, what the students want to know, and emphasizing the students' communication. They report prioritizing the students' communication in their assessment by targeting accuracy, fluency, and complexity measures in a balanced way across a range of competencies. So these reported practices, I think you can see, are really quite different before versus after their PD. So the question then becomes, do these newly reported practices line up well with what we know the students need based on their proficiency and confidence? I always say competence because that's the word I use most in my world, and sheep and sheep. So comparing the teachers and the students again, well, we see that the teachers' new focus on the oral skills, particularly speaking, is targeting the students' weaker oral skills and their productive abilities and their marked lack of confidence in speaking. The teacher's new presentation of language on demand based on what the students really want to communicate supports nicely the students in using language accurately in context. And we see that the teacher's new balanced approach to accuracy, fluency, and complexity targets the students' need to maintain their strengths in the presentation of information when they're speaking and writing, while hopefully improving their accuracy measures. So we see that the teacher's new CEFR-informed practices really are targeting very nicely those areas of students' greatest proficiency and confidence needs. What are some of the limitations of this study? Well, my guess is you can probably get there without me telling you, but I'll tell you anyway. The teacher data is self-reported rather than observed. So how accurate is it? Let's take the worst case scenario and say it's not accurate. Is it useless? No, at the very least, what it signifies is that they've understood the messaging of the CEFR and they're now poised to be able to make changes if they wish. So worst case scenario, they've at least understood what the CEFR is and how it could be changing their practice. I don't believe that what the teachers are telling us is completely wrong, but we often see in research that people tend to overestimate when they self-report, but that's okay, right? So even if it's not quite as amazing as we think it is, if it's not this entirely new transformed pedagogy, it probably is changed, right, in the directions they're reporting. Remember that the teacher participants were invited. So they may be the most motivated teachers out there. So the question is, are they representative? They may not be representative, and that's okay too. What this research is not saying, look, every French teacher in the province is doing this. That's not the point of this research. The research is saying, look, we have 103 highly motivated teachers from across the province telling us what kind of impact CEFR-informed professional learning is having on their practice, and it looks pretty good. Okay, so these teachers, even if they're not representative of everybody, and even if they're overstating matters a little, they can still spark change in their colleagues, right? And then the other caveat I'd like to point out is we don't yet have student proficiency and confidence results to see if these after practices on the parts of the teacher are really going to bring about the changes that we would hope to see in the students. That will take probably another 10 or 15 years to make sure that these practices really are widespread, to make sure that the students who are coming up into the research have gone through a system from the beginning where this is happening.
Have there been maybe like smaller scale like case studies that have shown a similar thing? In terms of like seeing the after?
Yeah, so there have been some studies in just in terms of the Canadian context, and then I'll let Enrica answer too, because she probably knows the European literature better than I do. In the Canadian context, there have been some studies that ask students how they feel when they've been in CEFR-informed contexts, and they feel really good. But there hasn't been that I know of a really long-term rigorous study. It's just too soon. Enrica, unless you know.
No, there hasn't been either in Europe, because the CFR has entered very much at the beginning just as a standard, So, and even in that respect, there haven't been studies for seeing really, although some claim to be studied on impact, but there is not much. But one characteristics of the way it has entered in Canada is this interest in the pedagogical side. And although here the pedagogy is entered through an exam, which sounds strange, but in reality, the most interesting part has been this interest in the pedagogical side, which we have also seen with our study in the CEFR, the project I have presented, because honestly, in the other part, the first layer of seeing the CEFR as a standard setting tool was still stronger. It is changing a lot now, even in Europe, but the importance of ALTE, the Association of Language Testers, and the work of the Cambridge exam was really strong in giving that impression, whereas here in Canada, the pedagogical part. But it's true that a long-term study it's not yet been done.
I think it's too soon. But I think it will come. I think that the timing needs another 10 years to really be able to see some solid results, because what you don't want to do is to go in too soon and say, oh, look, it's the same as it was before, and then everybody loses hope and interest and say, oh, look, it didn't lead anywhere. Well, that's because you went in too soon. So you really have to be careful, I think, in your timing of that kind of study. Yeah.
And I think still, though, it was a good practice for self-reflection and the change that it brought to their practice. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and to link it up with what are the outcomes of the students now and where are their needs and how are these reported practices lining up with where we know the needs are. So at least it's poised, which is leading to my takeaway message. The CEFR related professional learning that these teachers are engaging in is having a positive, powerful impact on their reported classroom practices. And these changes that they're reporting are in line with the principles and spirit of the CEFR. And we see that they're poised to, meaning they could very well strengthen the areas of greatest proficiency and confidence needs for the students. We don't know yet, but they're poised to potentially have a pretty significant impact on what the students are able to do.
If there is one risk that is the opposite of Europe. In Europe, it has entered through the through assessment, and now it's going down, trickling down to the methodology. But here, it has been more bottom up, so much more interestingly through methodologies. But then there is the assessment that is kind of imposed from outside that is not aligned with the CFR and may risk to reduce very much the impact of this kind of nice flourishing awareness that they have. Then because assessment is such a strong driving force, if they have then to compromise too much because they have to follow assessment practices and scales that are imposed, then it may be empty. So there is a risk also.
There's definitely a risk, and what's nice in Ontario at least is that the Ministry of Education seems to be behind this movement, and the curriculum planners are behind this movement. The new framework for FSL is now also CEFR informed. So Enrica's absolutely right. The danger is you have all this wonderful pedagogy happening, right? Like in the goals of assessment, but then if the criteria for assessment are still in a different framework, it exactly as Enrica says, it risks pulling us backwards. But with the ministry behind it in Ontario, I think it has a much better chance of succeeding than in some of the provinces in Canada where you have sort of grassroots support and not ministerial support.
Yeah. Could it be put together in any way for a school district to use for their own professional development, a half-day workshop that the teachers could choose? I'm just thinking because where I'm from, I'm in British Columbia, we have 5 professional development days. 3 are within our school-based, and the other 2 are up to us to choose. The district puts their best effort together. That's where I can see it happening.
Yeah.
And the other one is choice. You go to a provincial or you stay put, do something.
So one of the forms of PD, the professional learning, professional development that these teachers engaged in were these board-created professional development days. And what's really interesting is that we know that the kind of professional development that works best for teachers is professional development that's linked to their curriculum and that's linked to what they actually have to do in the classroom. So if somebody flies in from nowhere and says, well, look at this really fun, fancy thing, but the teachers can't see how it's related to what they have to do, and they don't see a really concrete way of doing it, and if it just comes once and is gone, that doesn't work as well. We know this from the literature as professional development that's sustained, that's intensive and extensive, that's linked to the curriculum, and that's shown to them in a way that is sort of actionable. And I don't know if Enrica wants to say anything about what she's planning.
Yeah, our plans, common plans are to, what we saw is the difficulty that teachers have in implementing the new idea of action-oriented, etc. They love it, but it's not easy then to translate it when don't have a background, you don't have textbooks that are really helping you, you have to struggle with assessment practices that are not necessarily the best. So what we are trying to, we hope we will get some funding to do, is to really investigate the teachers' beliefs and what is their kind of position, where they are at, why they find certain things so difficult, because we kind of know that, but you have to base the things if you want to develop something on real data, not just on anecdotal, and then from there to develop professional development modules, but in the form of kind of building blocks, like small things, like how do I work with an authentic document? How do I organize a kind of interaction between students that makes sense and is a real interaction and not just a kind of let's pretend and stuff like that, so that they can then combine these building blocks according to where they stand, all the way to a real action-oriented approach. And the idea would be to do them that with the teachers, with a validation process similar to what Dr. Nota had explained during the first lecture, where you send back to the teachers stuff and you get their feedback and you modify accordingly until you really have distilled what is feasible, as you said, what they can, what can be presented in a way that they can see the point, they can understand how it can be used, and it makes sense for them. That's a big project. So if we get the money, we do that. If we don't, I don't know. We have to be creative and try to downscale or see other sources. We'll see.
If I'm allowed to ask you a question, I know it's discussion time, you're supposed to ask me questions, but I'm curious, for those of you who've been listening to me, not from a French as a second language background, do you see any parallels between what I've been talking about and what you know of your own teaching contexts or your own learning contexts if you're not a teacher? You see any connections? Yeah?
It's the same.
Yeah. What context are you working in, or?
I'm a teacher of English in Chile.
Ah.
And I'm working in policy development in Chile as well, trying to make as well connections with the Common European framework with the curriculum in Chile.
Ah, okay.
Teachers are like well versed in what the CEFR means and what is, I don't know, all the coding, A1, B1, they're super okay with that. But when it comes to classroom practices, literally the same. Grammar and in Spanish.
Yeah.
And that's it. I mean, like the few accounts that we have, like in research, the reports what teachers do in the classroom, it's literally pretty much the same. Like little emphasis on communication and everything that form focus, linguistic, like hard. Yeah. Linguistic knowledge. I mean, the one that you guys teach or receive at university.
Yeah.
And then you're teaching, I don't know, closest to, I don't know, year 8. Like, yeah. So like, there's a very, I don't know, huge imbalance between the prescription that is like aligned to the levels, yeah. But when it comes to practice, it's something totally different.
Which is very, very understandable, but also very disheartening. What you really need is what I really applaud the Ontario Ministry of Education for putting its emphasis really where its mouth is, putting its money where its mouth is. Do you know that expression? You can say something, but then you can also do something. And they really are putting together some really useful professional development opportunities for teachers that really do seem to be transforming at least their thoughts and in theory their practice. Yeah. Yeah.
Let's say in my context as well, I was teaching in private institute in China, and most of the clients, we call them clients.
Yeah.
That's just how the school works.
Yeah.
And
Were you teaching EFL or were you teaching Chinese?
EFL. I was teaching EFL.
Yeah.
And most clients come into the school and they have a very clear defined outcome that is they're expecting. So most of them are participating in high-stakes exams, whether it's the university entrance exam or at the national English assessment that they have to pass a certain band, and or they're participating in either TOEFL or IELTS test. So in those type of contexts, it's very difficult for the teachers, as much as we want to understand students eventually when they go to another country, they will need the skills to communicate in the language. But for the time being, when they're at the school, they just need to focus on passing those exams where the form of assessment is very much filling the blanks, multiple choice, and writing grammatically clear sentences.
Well, I mean, this harkens back to exactly what Enrica was saying is the risk, right? I mean, it's not quite the same context, but if the ultimate goal is to do well on a form of assessment that doesn't value communication, then it's very risky to be doing these pedagogical things that really focus on communication. Luckily in Ontario, we don't have quite the same situation as you're describing in the school where you're teaching, but yet the risk is still there if the teachers are being asked to assess in a particular way that's not consonant with how they're teaching. Yeah. Yep.
I'm actually hoping you can maybe answer a question about my context, because you mentioned you were also in like L1 context for French, and that is my background. Like I did my homeschooling in French in Ontario, and did my teachers ed in it as well.
Nice.
And I've been thinking a lot about how we teach English in the French school boards in Ontario, and it's not one of my teachables, so I don't know what they have been teaching in teacher education.
Yeah.
But I don't remember anything being similar to the CFR when I was in school in English, and I'm wondering if you know if there is an approach that's similar or if it's not really relevant given the dominant context, or...
Yeah, so I mean, I can say two things in response to that. The first thing I'll say is a very honest, I really don't know, because my work in the Francophone schools is actually focusing on the learning of French. So particularly in the minority context, looking at students from Francophone homes who are still reliant on the school primarily for their input in French, because maybe it's a mixed marriage, or maybe French has been kind of dropped or overwhelmed by English. So the real answer is I don't know. But what I can say is that learning English as a minority Francophone in Ontario is clearly not the same thing as learning French as a minority language in Ontario, because when you step out of your door, even in a Francophone dominant community, there's still kind of English everywhere. And so you have a different kind of motivation, a different kind of availability of opportunities to interact that really are much more difficult to find in French.
Do you think there are like aspects of the CEFR that could be useful in still, like, we had a joke about how you'll just like catch English one day and you'll start speaking it, but are there aspects that can still be used?
Absolutely. I mean, I certainly have a lot to say, but Enrica,
Go ahead with that, because I wanted to add something later.
Sure. So I mean, this idea that you'll catch it. I mean, you'll catch it to a certain degree, but I mean, it's sort of like saying, so for example, my husband is Sicilian, and his mother didn't speak any English, and so for 10 or 15 years, I sat with her at a table, and she would speak to me in Sicilian, and I'd answer her in English. And I went to Sicily for the first time 5 years ago. I'm losing track of time, and I was amazed sitting around the table that I could follow what people were saying. But I couldn't say a thing, right? And then so they would say something, and I'm like, ooh, did they say they are going or they aren't going? Ooh. So I mean, yes, you can catch some of it, but there's a difference between catching some of it and really being able to act as a social agent, right? Like I had no real agency there. In fact, it was kind of depressing in some ways. I'm like, oh, I can hear all this stuff, but I can't be part of it because I didn't really have the tools to do it. So yeah, you can catch some of it, but there's a lot that could be offered through the CEFR about actually being an active, like that's why action-oriented is so important. It's more than just sort of having all this input come at you.
I wanted to add something about English. There is an issue here because English is not following ESL, is not following the CFR. They have invented a new system, and this has happened only a few years ago. Like I think it started when I was hired in year 2009. The CFR had already been published like 8 years in advance on paper, but it had circulated a good over 10 years because 98 online. And yet here they started a big project that was funded probably by the ministry, I don't know, but it created a new tool called the STEP to judge to assess English GSL that is not been, is not related really to the CFR. It's way farther than, for example, the CLB can be from the CLB of the Canadian language benchmarks that I used for newcomers, for example, and existing English and French. And although the two tools have been developed completely separately in a parallel, like in the 90s, they didn't know about each other, but for some reason they kind of follow a bit the same logic, at least broadly speaking, and that was that allowed, for example, us to do a big project where we kind of compared. But I don't see it. It would be very difficult to compare the CFR levels with STEP, and this was a kind of strange decision for me when I arrived. My first reaction, very naive, was, why are you doing a new thing? They exist already. Why don't you adopt that and adapt to something? In the US existed ACTFL, the ACTFL scale. That was another good starting point. Something that had already, and so I think that we missed the golden opportunity here to have French, because it was already visible that Canada would be interested in the CFR. There had been a big report written by Larry van der Grief in 2006 that he presented officially in Strasbourg in 2007, and saying that Canada had a lot of interest in trying to learn more about the CFR because of the kind of typology of the country, 2 official languages, of a lot of multilingualism because of the immigrants. So it's you can't say that they didn't know that the CFR would become popular in Canada. And now we are at the situation where it is becoming more and more popular for French and for international languages and not for ESL. At least in Ontario, not.
But I can add one thing. I can't say too much because there are what's it called? Not a gag order. That's for that's for criminals or whatever. But there's like privacy, whatever it is involved. I can't say too much. But I do know that the Canadian government is putting together a language learning app for FSL and ESL. And it's going to be CEFR oriented and informed. So hopefully things will change. Maybe the light has been seen. Maybe we'll see more of it coming together.
Yeah,
When is that planning to be implemented or launched?
Very soon. So the calls for proposals have come out.
Yeah.
People are putting together proposals as we speak.
Yeah,
That's really, really great to hear.
Yeah.
yeah, it's a big project. It's $1 million project.
And it will be made freely available to all Canadians.
It sounds like just what we need.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, it's us
Yeah.
2 hands here. Yeah, here and then here.
The project you just mentioned, it includes the international program like Spanish,
free in public?
For the language learning app,
Yes.
it's unfortunately just for English and French, Canada's 2 official languages. Yeah.
Just my recommendation about stuff, maybe also touch on the international program here. Because my research interest is like one special language program. It is under the international language program in the public elementary school.
Yeah.
So I did some research on it, like on the document they said they suggest international language teacher to follow the self and action-oriented method. And but when I step into the classroom, I feel like the teacher didn't follow that much. And somewhere, most of the international language school teacher, they are kind of like part-time, not belongs to the public education system. So how this is a question from me, like how will you let those international language teachers know about the CEFR and implement this whole system, and how will you train them?
Yeah,
So
it's an
curious.
excellent question. And in addition to that, you have the universities as well who are engaged in language teaching. But I mean, the teachers who are teaching there are not necessarily trained language teachers. They don't belong to a teachers' federation. They don't have mandatory professional development. So very much in the same way that you're talking about, how do we reach these teachers when we don't have the force of the Ministry of Education to come in and say, okay, here's some PD, go learn it. Yeah, so it's really quite a challenge. I mean, the ideal would be that all of the teachers of language in all of the realms where it's happening are offered this kind of professional development. How that happens is a little bit more of a tricky question, but you're absolutely right to be bringing this to the fore. We can't be forgetting, all the contexts in which language teaching is happening. Yeah.
I think
we have
it's
time for
grassroots movement. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I think she was going to ask something different.
Yeah.
Did you just want to respond to that question? Did you want to respond to that comment before we move to something?
Fine.
You're good? Okay.
No.
Yeah.
So I used to teach EFL back in Shanghai, China.
Yeah.
And I find it interesting to hear you say that the teachers in your research, after the professional learning, they all reported that they would no longer present the language in isolated ways.
Yeah.
Because it was hard for me to imagine how they do that, especially when they're dealing with like language beginning learners.
Yeah.
Because inevitably we're gonna present some kind of language, like maybe mechanically for them to learn. Because I believe all kinds of learning, all kinds of study starts from imitation. When there is a kind of knowledge base that we can talk about, or center interaction, or what else? I'm just saying I'm not saying disconnected language presenting ways are good. I'm just saying it's just impossible to exclude them because.
Right. So there's a difference between isolated and disconnected and focused. Right? So you can focus on, so with my daughter, for example, she's 6 years old, and in English, she still sometimes generalizes past tense rules, right? So she'll say, I ran, instead of I ran, or she'll say, I run. So either way, sometimes she'll get the ran and then put an ED, sometimes she'll say run and ED. So when she's in the moment and talking about it, I can ask her about why did she say what she did, and it's still focused, it's still focusing on the form, but at least it's connected to what she's saying. Or sometimes she'll be talking about something and she'll get to a point and she's like, what's that word? And she's looking for a word, and I can talk to her about vocabulary, I can talk to her about that word in a way that's really focused and concrete and oriented towards the form, but it's still connected to what she wants to express in the moment, in the context, right? So, I'm not saying that that's the ideal way to do it, but I'm saying that you still can do some degree of focusing on a form, as long as it's sort of connected to a context that somebody really wants to authentically communicate in. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. But what you're saying is something that I hear so often, and it's an absolutely important thing for us not to forget, that teachers of all different kinds sometimes find it very difficult to imagine teaching that's different from what they've known. Right? So what would it look like if I wanted to teach language in a way that I've just never seen it before, right? It's hard for them to imagine, and that's exactly what Enrica was talking about in this project that she's created. We need to be helping teachers imagine another possibility. So think about when you learned your first language, whatever your first language was. When was the first time you had grammar input, like focused, explicit grammar input? Probably when you reached school. Probably, right? How old were you by then? 6, 5, 6, 7, 5, depends what your country is. So you had 5 years at least of intensive language teaching by communicating in the real world, like being an agent in your own life doing social things, right? So I mean, that's what language learning can look like. She's like, I don't believe you, because I mean, it's little kids, right? But it's true, right? So what we need to do is to understand that it can happen. We've all done it, but we never think of that when we're thinking about language teaching, because, you know, I'm not a baby, I'm not living in a family, I'm an adult in a classroom. So how can we transform our classrooms into something that's more, you know, that's better suited to producing input that's going to get us where we need to go?
It was a very interesting example that a professor, a colleague in the US, very famous by the way, Jan Larsen Freeman, gave in a presentation to teachers. She came here in Toronto, I think it was Tessel, Ontario, and she said, you know, when you ask, very often there is this repetition. How do you do, I would like to talk to such a person on the phone, for example. And she said, you want to pass this to your student, and instead of just having John and Mary and this and that repeat the same thing, which is super boring. She was pretending you were on the phone, and then you say, oh, sorry, wrong office, wait, I'll connect you to the other, and then you go and then, oh, this is not exactly the number, let me give you the right one. So she made a series of real things that we all have experience when we try to call a call center for having something repaired, I don't know, whatever. We do 4 or 5, we have 4 or 5 goes before we get to the right person. And we keep repeating the same request in slightly different forms, perhaps. So it was very interesting. It made me think that you can repeat the thing. Yes, it was repetition, but it was not dull repetition. It was really like, there is a context, there is a reason why you
already a knowledge base, because the students know what telephone is, what these words are.
Yeah, and they see the point of repeating. It's not like feeling stupid because you have to repeat it just to memorize, because, and basically maybe depending on your learning style, you don't even memorize just by repeating, because not everybody does that. So it was an interesting example.
But I think you're right that beginner learners, like teaching like absolute beginners, is probably the most challenging level to teach, but that's probably where you can have the biggest impact on your learners if you have this reoriented pedagogy. Because as I started out more than an hour ago, so I'll stop soon, as I started out by saying, what we learned first and what we learned best is what comes back to us in moments of stress. So imagine if what we learned first and what we learned best was how to communicate in authentic situations, that would be fantastic. That's what would come up most naturally to us. So maybe I'll stop there because I'm conscious of your time and all the other things you have to
I
do.
was just going to ask, did these teachers or the people that would eventually teach the students after their study was over have any information about metalinguistics? Because number 24, the authentic documents and action-oriented tasks on page 18, it seems to me that some of the comments also indicate that the students start to realize what they're doing with language, but they hadn't, before the study, they hadn't had that.
Right, so you're looking at the teacher study there,
That's the
and the
teacher
teachers are commenting on their students. Yeah, so I mean,
And
go ahead.
But in the other study as well, I'll flip to that one, it was their ability to think about their language.
Yeah,
was
exactly.
something that-
So, I mean, one of the nice things about the CEFR is that it doesn't avoid structure, and it doesn't avoid thinking about structure. It just embeds it in a context of need and use. So raising students' metalinguistic knowledge is absolutely fair game in the
Oh,
CEFR.
it's necessary,
Yeah.
actually, it's in, yes, it is, it's in CAP. And then I was gonna ask about the future. Would you consider doing this study with the intensive French students?
So intensive French is like the extended French. Extended French is one version of intensive French.
All right.
They go by different names. So in BC, it's called intensive French. In Ontario, it's called extended, and they were part of the study.
All right,
Yeah.
good, okay.
Any question from the people online?
Melissa, I know you. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at you over there, but you're also over here. Melissa, I know you're a French teacher. I don't know if I can hear you though.
You have to unmute your mic.
No, I can't hear you.
I don't know if this is an easy to answer question or if this is a loaded question, but either in regard, Catherine can answer.
Yeah.
I'm very happy to hear about this app, Canadian app, and seeing as the CFR is being more and more implemented in the Canadian context, do we see, or is there any question about a change of the wording of the CFR, like removing the European and then making it more Canadian or more contextualized to the Canadian context at all?
Yeah, if I could make one recommendation, Enrica, that you could take back to Brian, take the word European out of the title, and so many more people would fall in love with it.
Yeah,
They
but
hear
that-
the word European and they get frightened.
But that's a misunderstanding. I mean, things were born somewhere, you know? Actually, it's American Council of blah, blah, blah. No matter, it's American Council language. You can use it outside of America. Canadian language benchmarks are Canadian, and you can use them everywhere. It's where this document was born, and not that it's European in the soul. I don't know.
No,
Like,
the only way it's European in the soul is in a positive way. Europeans are open to multi-pluri things in a way that some other places are not. So in that sense,
yeah,
it's
well,
European.
this I'm happy you say that, because this is really something that I personally didn't expect. It's before coming the other side of the Atlantic. Very often, the European has a negative connotation. Is always accused of being colonial. I mean, this is also some kind of conflating everything. It's not, you can't simply say that, oh, because it's European, it's colonial, and because of course it's colonial, it's bad. It's a kind of very broad generalization, because and in a sense, there is always to fight against this idea. There is a big misunderstanding, for example, or lack of knowledge of what is the difference between the European Union, which is a political body, and the Council of Europe, which is not. It's a kind of completely different, not political in the sense of trying to help other countries to do certain policies, but the main goal is this idea of human rights and the rule of law, which is kind of, I don't think that this is colonial at all, no? So it's really very, sometimes even very tough. Last time we had this discussion, no, of what is plurilingualism, and there was even this accusation of it being the language of globalization. So no, actually, it's ESL, English lingua franca, actually, is the language of the language of globalization. Like, you don't need anything; you can do everything in English. That we know it's not possible. We are discovering it more and more, but still there, still behind the first layer, if you catch. So I personally don't think that it should ever be done to eliminate the European, because it's kind of losing their roots. By the way, it's used everywhere in the world, like from Japan to here to Australia to everywhere. So
Besides, the acronym works so much better with the E in it. Otherwise, it would be the CFR. But I am very conscious of your time. So thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure to be here.
So thank you for the questions. Thank you. Really
Yeah, thank you for
very much
engaging.
for
I'm glad that it seemed to spark some comments from you. So thank you.
Thank you for coming, really, for this wonderful and inspiring talk. Yeah, and we have our 20 minutes break and come back around 7. And it's mine is
That was a little bit.
so no, let's have the 20 minutes.
Goodbye, everyone online. Thank you for being here.
In a moment, have a break. And then, yeah.
So do you want me to close this down? Yeah, and it might still be recording actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, work. There's like 3 of us.